Hi, this is Bob Dickey back with part three of the series Building a Jewelry Box. Welcome back if you've been watching the first two parts of the series, and if not, when you get the link for this, you can take a look at those as well. So in this final part, I'm going to cover the remaining steps that lead up to the final finishing and assembly of the box. So we ended our last video after cutting off the box lid. The next step for me is to build the tray or trays that are going into the box. These are very simple construction using the same basic steps that we used for the box itself. Miter the sides to length, route a groove for the plywood bottom and cut that bottom to fit, and then glue up each tray. I typically use stock around 3/8 of an inch thick for the trays, and the width of the trays for a two tray box like this is typically set at half the internal width of the jewelry box. I do that because then by sliding them side to side, it's possible to access the complete bottom compartment without having to lift a tray out. Next, I make and fit a lid or lift handle for the lid. Lots of different options here, but this is one I use quite a bit. I mill the stock to approximately 2/10 of an inch, cut the handle on the scroll saw or bandsaw, and then sand the edges smooth on a disc sander. The next step is to lightly round over the edge on the router table. I use a 1/16 inch radius brass tipped bit, which is good for small parts like this and very thin stock. You'll notice that I start with a short climb cut to get a smooth start and then come back to that area and complete the full cut. I then use a centering rule to locate the center of the lid as well as the handle. And at those locations, I drill a 1/8 inch diameter hole, approximately 3/8 of an inch deep in each piece. Then I use a 1/8 inch dowel and medium CA glue to attach the handle to the lid. This has proven to be a reliable means of attaching the handle for me. I've never had one come off, at least that I'm aware of, in several years. So it works out quite nicely. As far as hinges go, I use Brusso hinges for the majority of the boxes that I build. They're among the best that you can get, but they are expensive. So for some of my smaller boxes, I will go with lesser hinges to manage the material costs. But at this juncture, it does no good to show how I mortise the hinges myself, as the tool I use has unfortunately been off the market for around 10 years now. Instead, I'll recommend a couple of ways it can be done with the router, and in one case, the router table, that I've used them both and found them to work well. The first is, they are both from Doug Stowe, by the way, so they've got to be good, master box maker that he is. But the first is an easy way to build a jig that's built up for a specific hinge geometry. So if you use a Brusso 102 or 103, something like that, you can use this design. You can find complete plans for that in the issue 2011, March-April of 2010 issue of Fine Woodworking magazine. Or if you're a member, you can find it on their member website. The second method is what Doug calls a flipping stick, or using a story stick to create a template for doing this on the router table. And complete instructions are in his book, Basic Box Making, which I highly recommend to anyone wanting to get into box making. The flipping stick is used at the router table. The only caveat here is that for each box, unless you're making multiples that are exactly the same width, you need a new stick for each when mortising. There are lots of other methods, of course, purchasing templates from Brusso, Rockler, and others, and of course, tried and true, chisel and clean it out the manual tool way. So the next step then for me is to make the divider grid. And in my designs, I always make these removable drop-in assemblies. That way they can be changed out for a different pattern or left out completely for an open compartment. I use, again, stock that's approximately 2/10 of an inch thick, and because consistent thickness is critical for a good assembly, I prep a good deal quantity at one time make sure it's all the same thickness, and then store it and use as needed. So that's what's stored in that black tube in the back in the photo on the left. I first cut all the pieces, the left and right pieces, the front to back pieces, and then I ripped the front to back pieces, the shorter ones, about 3/16 inch narrower than the others. To me, that just gives me better aesthetic effect when I create the grid and insert it. My toolkit for cutting slots to create the grid at the table saw are a point-to-point divider and a Bridge City Toolworks Kerfmaster. I don't know if that tool is still in the market, but there's a lot of plans for home-built versions that you can find on lumberjocks.com. Just go there and do a search for Kerfmaster. I use a combination blade with a high ATB grind to cut slots into cross pieces. One would logically think it should be a flat top grind, but this high ATB blade creates less chip out, and the construction hides the kerf bottom anyway, so flatness is not an issue. The point-to-point tool makes it easy to mark the locations of the slot, assuming that you want to have a symmetrical layout. And for ease of this whole operation, I try my darndest to have a symmetrical layout whenever possible. The Kerfmaster essentially adjusts for blade kerf, so the slot's created in 2 passes. Turning the jig end for end after it has been set for the saw kerf and the thickness of the stock that you're working with will create slots that will give you a nice snug fit. So now with all the pieces cut, I just need to start assembling. A press fit is good, but I also apply a small amount of thin CA glue at each cross point to make sure that the grid stays together. Now it's time to work on the lining sheets for the tray and box bottom. Having a self-healing cutting pad is very, very useful in this step and several others that will follow this. The mat cutter is a good option. I found that one on sale a few years ago, but a utility knife with a good straight edge works just fine. For lining the box and trays, I use a faux suede upholstery fabric from Jo-Ann Fabrics. It's rugged, yet it has an elegant look and feel. At retail, it's expensive, but watch for their 40% off coupons. That's when I do my shopping. And that makes it quite inexpensive, actually, on a square foot basis. The backing that I use is called chipboard, 14-ply chipboard, which is an inexpensive backer cardboard used in picture framing. I get mine from Blick Art Supply, but many retail framing departments have it as well. And a 22 by 28 inch piece is less than $1. The cutting pad again is worthwhile as a base for cutting the fabric. I leave about an inch extra all around the chipboard, which itself was cut to be about 3/32 of an inch less than the actual inside dimensions of the piece to allow for the fabric rollover. Next step is to apply the fabric to the chipboard, and I spray one side of the chipboard pieces with spray adhesive. I use 3M Super 77. Let it sit for at least 30 seconds and then lay it down on top of the cut fabric pieces. But be careful when you spray. These cans like to spit, and if you get a glob of adhesive, it may well soak through the fabric and ruin it. I can attest to that many times. Next, I cut the corners of the fabric at a 45-degree angle so that when I wrap it around the edge, there's no overlap with the corners, which would cause those to be proud of the base. Then spray adhesive on both the fabric and corresponding areas of the chipboard where it's going to wrap around, and you do the spray in both surfaces to get a more permanent bond. Lastly, carefully wrap the fabric around to the back, starting at the middle of one side, and be careful not to get your hand or fingers into the adhesive. I can tell you that it undoubtedly finds its way to the good side, leaves an ugly print, and lets you start over again. So here we got the finished pieces, and of course I set those aside right now because the next step for the box is going to be applying the finish, and then when that's done we'll come back in and do the final assembly. So that does leave us right just to the final steps. Finishing, I happen to spray Mohawk Buff Coat lacquer. It's an excellent lacquer. It's got a heavy body, can be purchased from Klingspor Woodworking among others. And it's available conveniently both for spray systems as well as in spray cans. And it is heavy body, so it will build up faster than most of the other spray finishes that come in the aerosol cans. If you want ring bars, I have posted instructions for making those on my blog, which is www.artnabox.com, artnabox.com. And so with that, the box is pretty well done. So I want to thank you all for your interest. Sorry for this is kind of unprofessional in terms of my dialogue, but I'm trying to share much information as I can. If you have any questions, feel free to email me at bob@woodenonline.com. That's WOODNONLINE.com. And happy box making.